Continuing to the chapter, The People of Sparks. Travelers and Warriors. What Torren did. All day after Casper and Maddie left, Mrs. Mudo wondered where Lena was. Had the doctor sent her on an errand? She asked, but the answer was no. Did Torren know what and where she was? He said he didn't know and he didn't care, thinking maybe Lena had gone to the Pioneer Hotel to see Dune. Mrs. Morando walked down there, but no one had seen her. By the evening, when Lena was still missing, Mrs. Morando was very much worried. She found the note in her book that night. She found as she read it. This didn't seem like a good idea to her. It was one of the Lena's rash, impulsive acts, and probably it was dangerous. Mrs. Morado went downstairs, knocked on the doctor's door, and showed her the note. Can we send someone after them? She said, to bring her back. But the doctor shook her head. They had a whole day ahead, she said. No one could catch up, even if you could find someone willing to go. So Mrs. Morando went back to the bed and tried to sleep. She told herself that Lena had survived many dangers before, but still she lays awake, worrying most of the nights. In the morning at the breakfast, Torren asked where Lena was, and Mrs. Morando told him. He jumped up from his chair. He threw down his piece of bread, which bounced on the table. She went with them. He cried. She went with the Casper. Calm down, said Dr. Hester. No, yelled Torren. I won't calm down. I have her. I hate all you have cave people. Why did you have to come here and ruin everything? With a furious swiping on his hand, he knocked over Mrs. Morando's cup of tea. He kicked backward at his chair, which fell over, and he ran out of the room. Through the windows, Mrs. Morando saw him racing across the courtyard and out the gate. Jealous, said the doctor. He wants a Casper all to himself. Heaven knows why. The boy craved the attentions, said Mrs. Morando. I doubt that he cares who it comes from. I suppose you are right, said the doctor, looking at Mrs. Morando with a faint surprise. Torren sped down the river road full of a boiling rage. He was the one who should be sitting beside the Casper, not that the fat Maddie and not the stupid cave girl. He should be there, riding on the truck, going away to a Roma. But she had a snuff off and done it instead, and he hated her for it. It was the worst thing that had happened to him in his whole life. He ran a long way, his feet pounding the dusty road, his fist pumping back and forth, furious tears streaming down in his face. When he stopped painting, he was away out in the tomato field, not far from the wind tower where he had been the day the cave people came over the hills. He remembered how they had looked like a strand of an horrible insects coming down towards the village. Now the cave people have settled in as if they were going to stay forever. They were eating the food that should belong to the Sparks people. They were wearing the clothes that Spark peoples had given them. They walked around in the street of Spark as if they belonged here. Torren wanted them gone. He stomped among the tomato plant, throwing the punches at the air. Get out of here! Get out! He cried, as if Lena and all the Emerbites were there to hear him. His thought was like a flame inside his head. He kept seeing Casper on the seat of his truck with a Maddie on one side of him and Lena on the other. The feeling that went with his picture was like a sharp stick in his stomach. If only he had one of those Jeanne bombs they had in the old days. He imagined they were about the size of an watermelon. He would shoot one at Lena. Pow! It would sail halfway to the city and draw the right on the Casper's truck and blew them up. Then he would shoot another one at a Pioneer Hotel, Blum. It would flatten the building and blow up everyone on the cave people. He longed to throw that big bomb. He could almost feel it in his hand. He had come out at the end of a row of a plant now where a small whitewashed storage shed stood at the edge of the field. Crates of tomatoes were stacked nearby, ready to be disturbed. Without thinking, Torin grabbed a tomato from the nearest creature and hurled it against the wall of a shed. It splattered. Red water dripped down the white wall. I felt so good to do this that he did it again. In a fury, he snatched up one tomato after the another. Warm, warm, warm. He flung them all with all his might until the window of the shed splintered. The walls was bleeding mess and a long mound of unbroken red flesh lay on the ground. He stopped and took a breath. What would the farmers think when they saw this? Two whole creatures of an tomatoes smashed. They would be angry, but they wouldn't know he had done it, would they? No one had seen him. And that's what, when an idea floated into Torrens's mind, a really excellent idea, he smiled, thinking about it. He threw on last tomato, aiming for the dark, glass-toothed hole of a broken window. There was a satisfying crash as the tomato knocked someone thing over inside. Torrent turned and ran, but he didn't go all the way home. When Dawn came through the town that morning, on the way to the work, he found Mrs. Morando waiting for him by the side of a road. She signaled to him with one finger, and he felt the stream of workers and came over to her. Lena had gone off, she said. I thought you should know. Gone off. Gone off where? Mrs. Morando produced a scrap of paper from the pocket of her shirt. Read this, she said. Don't read. He scrunched up his nose in the puzzlement. He remembered Lena telling him something that the other day about these people, Casper and Maddie. What had she said? He tried to recall. He looked again at the note. Something important, she says. What would be that? Something important, she says. What would be that? Mrs. Morado stroked her thin shoulders. She got an idea in her head. She said. Dawn could see that she was worried, though she didn't say so. Well, she says that she will be back in 2 or 3 days, said Dawn. That is not so long. The odd things say that Mrs. Morando, that the Casper, when he left, said that he wouldn't be back for the several months. Dawn frowned. What was Lena up to? He didn't understand it, but he didn't want to make Mrs. Morando more worried than she was. She must have some plan for getting back, he said, handing back the note. Of course, said Mrs. Morando briskly. She folded the note and replaced it in her pocket. There is no need to worry. I will have her come and find you as soon as she returns. She headed back towards the doctor's house and Dawn went towards the fields. He walked slowly to give himself the time to think. He was upset about Lena. How could she be so foolish as to launch herself out in an unknown world with 2 unknown people? But in a way she wasn't surprised. Lena was always eager to investigate the new places. Look how she had gone up to the roof of an gathering hall on the first day she became a messenger in the Ember. Look how eager she has been go to the down in the pipe works. She probably just wanted to see what was outside of the sparks. As soon as she should satisfy her curiosity, she would be back. But Dawn was upset about Lena for the another reason too. It didn't have to do with her safety. He was upset that she had gone exploring without him. All through the last day of an Ember, they had been partners. Now she had gone of her own, leaving him here. He was annoyed and he was hurt. He had to admit to himself that he had been a very good friend to Lena lately. Maybe he would hurt her feelings by paying so much attention to Tig. But still, it was Lena who was his partner in the most important things. If she had an urgent reason for hitching a ride with a Casper, why haven't she told him? Why haven't she asked him to come along? He trudged towards the tomatoes field, head down, snuffing his shoes irritably in the dust, and so he didn't notice until he was right up to it that a commission was going on by the storage shed. Everyone was crowded around it, and the chucker, the team leader, was yelling. Don't hurry forward to see what was going on. Wasted, wasted, was Chucker was shouting. Two whole crats smashed. Who done this? And the shed plastered with the mask, and the windows broken. He glared at the crowd of the workers. And of you know about this? He demanded. Anyone knows what mad person did this? No one said a word. Don't stare with an horror at the mess on the wall. It looks like glory, as if it is were smashed animal instead of just tomatoes. He could feel the rage of a person who had done it. I don't like this, Chugger said darkly. Nothing like this ever happened before you people arrived. I wanted to clean up right away. Walls washed, window fixed, mess cleared away. Get on it. Listen, said someone. Don't turn to see. It was a tick speaking. We didn't do this. Don't get all tough with us. Chucker whipped around. Who else would do it? Who else but one of you, always gripping and crumbling? But we only just got here now. He would. How could we have done it? Someone called out. Beside, we don't, cried someone else. We would never waste food. More and more voices rose in the present. Doon added his to saying, it wasn't us. It couldn't have been. But the chugger just stood and scowled at them. Finally he yelled, quiet, get to the work. Just after that, Doon had running towards the behind him and turned to see that Torrent racing across the field. He was shouting in his thrill, his voice at his he came. I saw, he cried, waving his arm. Last night I was out here and I saw. He ran into the midst of a worker and stood panting, his little eyes wild. I heard a thump thump thump, so I snuffed up to see, and I did see. Well then, said Sugar, what did you see? I saw who threw the tomato. I saw who made that big mess and broke the window. He stood with his neck poked forward and his skinny arms held tight to his sides. His whole body was trembling with an excitement. His eyes scanned the group of the workers. It was him, he shirished, pointing out straight at Doom. It was him that I did. I say him. Doon was so shocked he couldn't make a noise. He stood with his mouth open, staring at Torrent. Around him a few people spoke up. He did not, said someone. He couldn't have anyway. He wouldn't. No, someone else said. He would never do that. But Chugger seized his arm and pulled him rough aside. What do you have to say for yourself? Is this your doing? Don shook his head. No, he said. No, that boy is lying. And why would he do that? Why would he take the trouble to come out here first thing in the morning to point to you and lie? I don't know, said Don. Chugger released his arm with a push. I will be keeping a special eye on you from now on, he said. But why? Said Don. I didn't do this. How do I know that? Said Chugger. It is your worst against his, and he is the one of us. A long hot drive. Lena lay very still, or as still as she would with the jolting of a truck over the rusted road. Her eyes were at the level of a space between the two lowest soles of the crate, so she could see out just enough to guess where they were. Along the road by the rivers first and then turning to the around the outskirts of the villages. Occasionally she heard someone calls a greeting into Casper, and she heard Casper's voice returning it. Maddie never said anything that Lena could hear. After a while there were no more voices. The sun beat down on Lena's back, and she began to get terribly hot and uncomfortable. She thought it might be safe to sit up now. The sound of her wheels would muffle any sound she made, and she was far enough towards the back of a truck so that the Casper and Maddie wouldn't see her moving. So she unfolded herself. She peered out and saw an emptiness, vast stretches of a dry brown gold grasses, no people, no houses. It was an enormous space. She has not realized any place could be so big. Sometimes in the afternoon, because of the heat and rocking motion of the track, and because there was nothing else to do, Lena went to sleep. When she awoke, she could tell right away that it was nearly evening. The air was cooler and the sun was so low in the sky that she could no longer see it overhead. Its slanting rays came between the slats of her cut. A crimp a cramp gripped her stomach. It was partially hunger. She hadn't thought to bring any food with her, but it was mostly fear. They must be close to the city, and when they arrived, what would she do? And what would Casper do when he found her? The truck slowed and came to a stop. Lena felt Casper and Maddie jump down. This looked like a good enough place, said the Casper's voice. Near the water anyhow. Looks all right to me. That was Maddie's voice. I will take the animals down to the stream, and Casper. Lena heard chanting and slapping the sounds as if unbuckled the harness, and then the slow thud of an hooves as the oxen were led away. What was Maddie doing? Lena heard a few steps, some rustling among the grasses. Then there was a silence. She had to move. Her legs were scrambled and she had a pain in her back. Cautiously, she stood up. She stepped on the first slat of her crate and then the second, and when she got high enough to look over the top edge, the first thing she saw was Maddie, sitting on a ground a few feet from the ends of a truck, leaning against a tree and staring right at her. Well, well, said Maddie, look who is here. Lena just stared. She couldn't move. Maddie heaved herself up from the ground and came over to the truck. She regarded Lena with a hoop that was half puzzled and half amused. What is in the world are you doing here? I want to see the city, said Lena. Don't you know? It is a 5 days journey. How did you expect to ride in a cart all the time and not be discovered? 5 days. I thought it was 1 day. Maddie just shook her head. What are we supposed to do with you? I don't know, said Lena. She felt a trembling start up in her stomach. She would never have come. There was a long pause between Maddie spoke again. Then she said, listen, it would suit me fine if you come along to the city if you're sure you want to go. I don't want to, Lena said, though she wasn't really sure. Good, said Maddie, because it's look like you have no choices. She smiled. It wasn't an unfriendly smile, but there was a quirk in it that seems to say, what a situation. Stay there. Then she said, I will be back. She stamped away. Lena watched Maddie heading towards a strip of green grasses and a low trees that must border the stream. At the edge of this strip, she could see Casper and the oxen. In all the directions, the landscape was same. She could see the morning gently rolling empty on the buildings, covering with the brown gold grass. Here and there stood a low, dark green, mushroom-shaped tree. 3 of them stood near the truck, their leaves dusty and their trunk thin and gland. The sun had gone down behind the hills in the west, and the sky there was scarlet. Though the air was still warm, Lena shivered. She sat back down in the carrot, pulled her knees up to her chest, and wrapped her arms around them. Somewhere a bird sang It's going to be bed song. Then suddenly there were loud footsteps and the Casper voice coming towards her, and in a moment Casper fist thudding against the crack. Come out, he said. Lena climbed out and stood on the truck looking down at him. Just jump, he said. She jumped down. Casper glared at her, so he did say, a stowaway. What were you trying to do? Casper, cause any trouble? That your idea of fun? No, Lena said. I want to see the city. What for? A look of suspicion passed over the Casper's face. What do you know about the city? Nothing, said Lena. She wasn't going to tell Casper about her vision of a city or what the city might be for the poor of Ember. I just want to see it. Well, too bad, said Casper. Why should I take you there? Why would I want an extra person to feed, a kid to look after? Your ride stops right here. You can go back where you came from. Once again, said Maddie, listen to me before you decide. She could be useful to us. Don't be ridiculous. Capsa waved his two big hands together as if to dismiss the subject. Yes, she could, said Maddie. When you are looking for something in a ruined places, you know how it is small spaces sometimes. To be rubble where you need to step carefully. A small, light person could go wherever we couldn't. Casper took a step back and studied Lena, still glowering. Lena tried to look as small as light as she could. Ask for the food, said Maddie. She can share mine. Ridiculous, and said Casper again. But he kept his eyes on Lena. She could see he was thinking. Come on, Casper, Maddie said. Let's take her. We don't have much choice after all. The only other thing we can do is to leave her out here by herself. She turned to Lena. If we let you come, she said, you will have to work for us. You will have to do what we say. All right, Lena said, though she wasn't sure that it was all right at all. Maybe it would be the better to give up seeing the city and try to get back the sparks from here. But how would she do that? She had never been able to find her way, and the empty lands frightened her. She didn't want to be alone in such a vast, wild place. But how will I get back again? Will you take me? You should have thought of that when you climbed on the truck, said Casper. That is your problem, not ours. He turned to Maddie. Right, partner? Certainly, Maddie said. Now let us get settled for the night. The first thing we needed is some kindling. Lena and I will do and gather it. Lena followed her out towards the trees. One they were in among them. Maddie bent down and spoke to her in a low voice. Don't worry, you were foolish to do this, but I won't let harm come to you, and I will see you get home again, somehow. She straightened up again. How, she said, gathering up some dry twigs and sticks and a few tough of dry grasses. They carried the sticks and the gas back to where the truck was parked. There, Maddie scraped out a swallow hole in the ground with the heel of her shoes. In the hole, she set the smallest splinter of a wood, arranging them in a sort of a square. Over this, she placed some sticks, and on the top of those, she added a large branches. She stuck in a small handful of dry grasses at the bottom of this stick building. Until this point, Lena did not understand what she was doing. But when she pulled from her pocket a cloth-wrapped package and wrapped it, and took out a short blue type stick, she knew. She took in a quick breath and stepped backward. Maddie held up one of the matches and said, Have you ever seen none of these? Yes, said Lena. You are lucky then, said Maddie. They are rare. She struck the match across a rock and a blue strip burst into the flame. She held it to the grass, and the grass sized and flared up. Come and stand close, she said to Lena. We need to shield this from the breeze until it gets going. But Lena stayed where she was, staring. The little flame at the heart of a stack of a stick flickered. It reached for the splintered end of a stake, caught it, set it aflame. The sizzling grew to a hissing and then to a crackling. The flame jumped and jumped higher, and there again was an orange hand stretching upward with its pointed fingers, waving, leaning towards her. Lena stumbled backwards. She didn't want to be afraid. Caspar and Maddie weren't. Caspar had come back now and was crouching right beside the fire, feeding it with his stick and grass. But for Lena, it was as if the flames were shivering a mess at her. Run, run, run. She stood 20 feet away, staring at the fire with a pounding heart. The wind blew a ribbon of smoke at her, and when she breathed it stung the back on her throat. Maddie noticed after a while that she was out there. Come closer, Lena, she called. It won't hurt you. But Lena could not get her feet to walk towards the hissing, snapping blaze. It might not hurt Maddie and Caspar, but if she were to stand near it, she was sure it would reach for her with the orange hand, flick its fingers against the end of her hair, or then hem of her shirts, and she too would flare up. I'm all right here, she said. I don't want to be near it. Caspar laughed. Maddie lumbered to her feet and came beside Lena. She put an arm around her. You are shaking, she said. Well, never mind. You don't have to be by the fire if you don't want to. From a box of an turf, she took that what they call the traveler's cake, lump a little smaller than a fist, made of. Lena knew out what, and she was a Caspar, sucked them on the end of a long stick and roasted them over the flames. You have to get fond of these if you are a roamer, Caspar said. They keep well. That's their best quality. You need them for all those long stretches where there no other food to be found. These were a dry and tasteless, but Lena was hungry, so she didn't mind much. She ate her standing up, and she licked her fingers when she was through. She wondered where they were going to sleep. There was no room on the track, so she supposed they have to lie on the ground. It was quite dark now. A breeze had come up. For somewhere far away, she heard an animal noise. Zip, zip, zip. Then a long wail. Then an Eric chorus of an wail. What is that? She asked Maddie. Wolves, Maddie said. Out hunting. They are not very close, don't worry. Lena shivered. The darkness here was so enormous and so full of and terrible things. In Ember, except when there was a blackout, people were almost always safe in their beds when the darkness came. Lena wasn't used to being outside at night. She thought about Mrs. Morando, who would be getting into the bed in the doctor's attic room right now. Mrs. Morando would be worried about her. Poppy would be saying, Where is Yana? No one would imagine that she was out in this great emptiness with nothing between her and the sky. Maddie took some rolled up blanket from the truck and spread them on the ground. She put two of them close to the fire. The third she offered to Lena. Put this whenever you want to sleep, she said. Lena walked over to her take her blanket, and she did. Caspar tossed a big branch on the fire. Sparks sprayed up. Some flew sideways, caught by the wind. Lena jumped away, but a few sparks landed on her socks. She stamped her foot frantically, but this is the only made the sparks brighter. The threads of her socks glowed. On her ankle she felt a pain like a fierce bite. No, she cried. Get it off me. She shook her leg and carved her at her socks with her hand. Panic rose up in her, and she would have taken off running if the Maddie had not blocked her path and grabbed her in the strong arm. Once she stopped her, she bent down and put a hand over the burning place in Lena's socks. And when she took her hand away, The glow was out, but the pain was still there. Maddie took off Lena's shoes and socks and poured cold water on the burn. But it didn't help much. All night, Lena huddled on the ground until the thin blanket gritting her teeth against the pain on her leg and wishing she had never come on that awful journey. The next morning, after the breakfast of plums and the coarse bread, they set out again. Maddie made Lena a place to sit at the back of a truck between two of them crates. She took the blanket they had slept on and spread them on the rough floor of the truck. Lena could sit on the blanket, lean against the nearest crate, and dance her leg over the truck's back edge. The burn still hurt this morning. It was reddish, angry looking blister. After a while, as the sun came up, a sweet, grassy smell arose from the earth. Lena began to enjoy herself again. She watched the countryside fall away behind the truck, stretch on off the brown gold glass as big as the sky, tree like a hat, spikes, or rocky slopes. And this is how it was for the 4 more days. At night, they would find a place by a stream to sleep. If they could find a stream, they passed the other ox-pulled cars and trucks on their way, both going their direction and coming back. They would stop and talk with these roamers and sometimes trade with them for the food. Casper always asked if they had been to the city. Very few of them had. The one that had been there just shaking their heads when the Casper asked if they had found anything interesting. It is a waste of a time to go there. They said, don't bother. Most of the roamers they had met had been scouring in a way what they have called the suburbs, which Lena understood to mean towns by the lay around the city. Casper and Maddie hardly spoke to her at all during the days. After noon, they would stop the truck and get something to eat from the chest of provisions they had brought. At first, there was a dried fruits, but they soon used that up. After that, it was an travel's cake, morning, noon, and night. Casper always went to sleep right after he has filled his belly. He lay back on the ground and snored. Then Maddie wouldn't become to Lena with the lift of an head, and they would walk away from the Casper and find a place to sit, often beneath a tree on one of those trees that spread their branches out like the top of a mountain mushroom. They would sit in a soft grass and look up at the sky through the tree branches. Sometimes a breeze swept across the land and brought them the scent of dusty earth and dry weeds. After the lunch on their second day of traveling, Lena asked Maddie where she came from. A horrible place was all she said. Horrible in what way? Small, cold, and poor. Houses made of old boards. Bad soil for growing things. Never enough food. A place that was withering. What does that mean, withering? Lena asked. It means shrinking and dying. Things were going worst there. There was too much sickness, too much hunger, too much unhappiness. People were always quarreling, and a lot of them were leaving. It was ending. The place where I come from. I wanted to be somewhere that was beginning. Our city was ending too, said Lena. She looked up at a blue sky and thought about the sky in the ember, utter blackness, not a speck of light. No light shows anywhere in the ember now. There is no one left in our city, she said. Sparks is the place that is the beginning, said Maddie. If it came, get past the hard spot. Hard spot? Yes, like suddenly having to take in 400 people. Oh, said Lena, remembering the conflict in the village and all the reasons she has wanted to get away from there. Her heart sank. Maybe by the time we have back, that will be all over. All the trouble, she said. Maybe, said Maddie. I hope so. Spark is a whole lot better than where I came from. I can understand why you wanted to leave that place, said Lena. Pretty badly, said Maddie. Bad enough to take up with the fools. Fool, Maddie just tipped her head towards a sleeping Casper. You come with him just to get away, Lena whispered. Maddie nodded. Rumor hardly ever came to our little settlement, she said, mainly because we had nothing to trade. Casper was the only one I would have ever seen. I thought I might never see another, so I grabbed the chance. Why couldn't you just leave by yourself? I thought of it, Maddie said, but I didn't know where to go. I didn't know the roads or where the settlements were. I didn't know how I get the foods. I guess I wasn't quite bold enough to go alone. When you got to the Sparks, you could have stayed there, Lena said. You didn't have to keep traveling with him. I would have stayed, said Maddie, if I hadn't promised to help him on the quest of his. I try honor my promises, if I possibly can. That afternoon, as they traveled on across the rolling hills, Lena thought about the places that were ending and the places that were beginning. She knew about the endings. Now she wanted to be a part of a beginning. Maybe the people of an Ember could begin again in the city. If not, well, she wouldn't think that about that until she had to. On the second night, they pulled up beside the ruin of an town. Not much was left of it, but you could see that once there had been hundreds of houses. The concentrate foundations, overgrown with the weeds, lined up along the curved street. Here and there, or a or a chimney was still standing. Casper stooped the truck just beyond the outer of a row of a ruin, and Maddie went around to the back and opened this truck that held her dwelling supply of food. They had stopped beside a ditch where a trickle of water ran. It was green, clumsy water, but Lena drank it anyway. It was all there was. Casper seemed especially grouchy. His pink face was blotted and damp, and his eyes looked inflamed. He had forgotten to visit his mustache into the points, and his hung down at the corner of his mouth. He dug a crumbling traveler cake from the trunk and glowered at Maddie. What is the matter with you, anyway? He said. You haven't been very chatty later. I have never chatty, said Maddie calmly. Casper took a savage bite of his cake. It looks like traveling with a tree stump, he said. I thought you were going to be pleasant and helpful companion. Maddie did not reply to this. She cheeped, serenely racing out over the acres of fallen houses. Lena realized there was a certain beauty in the Maddie that she hadn't seen before. Her back was straight, she held her head high, and there was something unswallowable in her. The bones of her face were strong, and her gaze was firm. There was nothing flirty about her. You could see that the Casper was finding out that she was not what he had taken her for at the first. She was more than he would bargain for. On the third day, near evening, they saw a truck coming towards them from a great distance away. They were on a long, straight road with a few trees or a building to block their views. Just the dry brown grasses and a few ancient fences leaning over, and the flocks of a bird rising, swapping through the air and fluttering down again. Up ahead came this dark dot, toiling forward. In the 20 minutes or so, the two trucks drew near. Lena stood behind the Casper and Maddie, looking for word. This rumor looked poor. He had only one ox and shaggy, swag-backed animals, and on his truck they were only two creates, not four as on Casper's. The man himself was almost as shaggy as his ox. His hair was long, and his beard lay like an hairy brown bib against his chest. As he came closer, he stood up on his truck and shaded his eyes with his hand, and peering at them. Watch out for this one, Caspar said. Could be an bandit. Looks bad and mean and dangerous. When the other truck was 20 or 30 feet away, its driver suddenly halted on the trees. Terrace. His ox veered, and the truck turned sideways so that it blocked the road. Tina couldn't tell if he had done this on the purpose. This movement was jerky, as if something was wrong with him. He climbed down from his truck and stood in the front of it, his neck tucked down and his shoulders haunted as high as his ear, his eyes glittering in his fiery face. He stood there like that, saying nothing, waiting for them. Caspar stopped the truck. He stood up and leaned forward. Out of my way, you rat the wretch. More move than a flea, bitter rake. The rumor came a few places closer, his mouth open, a hole in a tongue of an bread. But no words came out. Lena could see the back of a Caspar's neck flush deep red. I said, out of my way. He snapped up his whip and sent the long lash curling out towards the man and snapped it few feet from his face. The rumor let out a howl. He lured towards them. All this happened in only a minute or so. Lena's heart was beating wildly. Was this a bandit? Was he going to attack them? She ducked down behind a crater and peeked between the salters. Caspar raised the whip again. Come any closer, and I will cut you to the shreds, he shouted. But before he could lash out, Maddie grabbed his arm. Wait, she said. Caspar tried to shake her off, but she yanked at him so hard he lost his balance and sat down again. Why not find out what the man wants before you attack him? She said. Caspar struggled against her, but she was strong. She managed to wrench the whip out of his hands. Then she jumped down and comforted the other Roma, who had halted just in the front of the truck. What do you want from us? She said to him, standing separately, quietly in his path, her hands on her wide hips. Why have you stopped us like this? The Roma backed up a step. He looked at her with his mouth hanging open. He was grubby, Lena saw. His hands and his fair feet was nearly black with the dirt. He mumbled something. Maddie bent closer to him. What? He mumbled again. She turned to Caspar, who was climbing down from the turf and was approaching with his first plunger. He says that he is out of the cake. She turned back to the man. How long since you have eaten? The man stared at his hand. He had a long, filthy fingernails. His finger twisted. 3 days, he croaked. Just cramps, 3 days. Well said, Caspar. If you think we were going to supply you with the food, you were very mistaken. Surely we can spare a couple of cakes, Maddie said. Caspar's face was dark red. We cannot, he said. We were on a special mission, extremely important. We need that food for ourselves, all of it. Lena thought it wasn't unreasonable. He can have one of mine, she said. Caspar whirled around. No, he said. You are going to need your strength. You are being ridiculous, said Maddie. But Caspar reached out and brushed her. Back in the truck, he said, and you turning back to the rumor. Get your rattler out of my way. If you want to stay alive. From the rumor came a sound Lena had never heard from a human being, a hoarse hissing sound, and if he was spitting a stream of fire straightened at Caspar's face. He did this twice, and then he turned away and scuttered back into his cart. He pulled on the ox's traces, and it moved a few feet along, just far enough for Caspar's to drive his Turk past it. Caspar yelled at him one more time as he passed. You shouldn't be a Roma if you can't feed yourself. He cracked his whip at the man and drove over. Lena climbed into a cart and sat it with her head on a knee for a while after this. She was horrified by the starving, filthy Roma. How did he came to be in such a state? Was it how the own fault? Was he a madman? But Caspar could give him something, couldn't he? Or were they so low on the food that losing any of its really would harm them? Her stomach lurched. She felt queasy, but she didn't know that if it was hunger or horror as what she had just seen. That night Lena woke up for a moment and heard the oxen making an unsettled noises. She heard a creaking sound too, but the sound stopped and she went back to the sleep. In the morning, Maddie discovered that they had been robbed. Well, well, she said, opening the food chest, look her. What? Said the Casper. You were wetting his mustache with a spit and twisted it into the point. Someone had been into our foot, said Maddie. I wonder who. Casper jumped to his feet. Into our foot? He didn't get much, Maddie said. Just 3 or 4, I guess. She put her hand in the chest and felt around. But he left us something. Sputtered with a rag, Casper halted himself up on the truck. When he looked into the food chest, he let out a string of furious swords. Lena crept out from under her blanket and stood up. What is this? She said. What happened? Our friend from yesterday have been for a visit, said Maddie. We wouldn't give him what he wanted, so he took it and left something for us too. Left what? Said Lena. Casper was shaking with fury. His face was dark red. Look this dirt and Maddie. I think he took what he wanted and dumped a bag of dirt on the rest. She wrinked her noses. Might be some ox dropping in here too. The slunk, Casper cried. The miserable rat. In my opinion, said Maddie, you should have given a couple of cakes in the first place. I didn't ask for your opinion, said Casper. You are going to get it anyway, said Maddie, suddenly furious. You turned a greasy old guy into an enemy in less than 2 minutes. You did it. You have done it over and over. I have seen you. You approach the people like an enemy and bam, they turn into it one, whether they were being with or not. It is my policy to be ready to defend myself, Casper scrawling at my moment. Fine, said Maddie. So now, because of your policy, we are out of cakes instead of 2, and we have a lot of dirt on the rest. She closed the chest, stood up, and glared at Casper with a mixture of an anger and snore. If you ask me, making a friends is a better defense than making the enemies. I didn't ask you, said Casper. On the 4th day, they went uphill, hours after the hours. The heat was terrible. The only water they found was at the bottom of a deep ravine. All 3 of them scrambled down, half stepping and half sliding, carrying the Casper's biggest pot, and wetting and gasping they lugged, and filled the pots back up so that the oxen could drink. Then they went uphill some more. It was late afternoon by the time they have come to the top of the ridge. Lena was so tired that by the time and so hot that she felt like an boiled vegetable, limp and runny. She was bit dazed too, only half awake, and she heard sharp exclamation from the Casper and Maddie. She jumped down and went around to the front. A tremendous view of a land and a water lay before her. Such immense water she had never seen. Green, blue, glittering in the ray of a late sun, white ripples racing across its surface. To her right, it stretched as far as she could see. But straight ahead, she could see the shore on the other side. Green trees covering the ground and the hills rising beyond. The baby said the Casper. This means we are not almost there. We go around the end of it and then north. When do we get into the city? Lena said. Tomorrow, said Caspar. His white face broke into a grin and laughed his high, weird laugh. He opened and closed his fingers, stretching and gripping, as if he were imagining a taking hold of something. We will be there tomorrow, and then our work begins. Dune assessed. Word of tomato throwing on an Torrance assassination on the Dune spread quickly through the sparks. Some people believed Torrance, some didn't, but no one could prove who was telling the truth. Torrance said that he had seen what he had seen in the mid of a day, when he couldn't sleep, and took a walk to the fields to look at the stars. Dune said that he had been home all right, sleeping, and that his father and the others in the room knew it. But people say that he could have slipped quietly out without anyone knowing. Couldn't he? He should have gone down there and done his mischievous and come back, and they all would have thought he had been sleeping the whole night. At the noon that day, when he and the others showed up at a Patton house for their midday meals, no one spoke to them. Martha led them in, and they sat down at the table where the places has been set for them as usual. Dune's father said, "Good day," and Mrs. Prostel said, "How are you?" And the Miss Thorne and Edward Pocket looked around at the family's stony faces and tried to smile. Orderly put the food on their plates, was it an even smaller amount than usual, and passed the plates to them. Kenny at a tiny mouthful, his eyes darted nearly nervously from the face to say, "Excuse me, but perhaps there had been a mistake." Martha looked at him coldly. "I don't believe so," she said. "Perhaps you are thinking," Dune father went on, "that my son Dune actually did what he has been accused of." "In this household," said Martha, "we do not approve for wasting food. Either do we," cried Dune. "I would never do such a thing. I didn't do it." All eyes turned towards Dune. He could feel a red flame rising in his face. "Dune, he could." "Really," he said, keeping his voice calm. "I didn't." "Who did it then?" said Orkney. "I don't know," said Dune. "No one knows," said Mr. Plosner in her finest voice. "Certainly we aren't going to believe the word of one unhappy little boy against the word of his young man, who had proved himself so outstanding." "Why not?" said Martha. "Torrent Clan is a decent boy as far as I know. I don't see why you call him unhappy. All you have to do is look at him," Mr. Ploster said. Miss Thorne nodded. "I do think she is right," she murmured. "Well, one of you people must have done it," Martha said. "Certainly none of us would have. Nothing has been proved one way or the other," said Dune's father. "I would be unfair to draw anything. My conclusion." There was an uncomfortable silence. Everyone focused on eating. When it was a time to leave, Kenny passed out the food parcels, and as she handed one to the door, he silently mouthed 3 words, "I believe you." At least one person was on his side. Dune thought it made him feel better, but only a little. In the end, because it was one person's words against the another, and there was no proof either way. Nothing was done. Officially, the identity of a tomato thrower remained a mystery, but the effects of all this was to make the people of the scar and the people of an ember even more resentful and suspicious of each other than they had been before. Dune felt unfriendly eyes following him whenever he went. At first, he tried to explain when the people glared at him that way. He spoke reasonably. "Why would I get up and walk all the way into the field in the middle of a night to throw tomatoes at the wall?" he said. "It doesn't make any sense," but people didn't seem interested in the reason. He was one of them, and that meant that he was strange and might do anything. So Dune stopped trying to explain. He kept his eyes on the ground and ignore the people who muttered darkly as he passed by. It wasn't just Doon who suffered from the tomato incident. It was all the refugees from the Embers. Sometimes the villagers called them the names right out on the street. It was as if those smashed tomatoes had brought all the quality rumbling restlessness out of it the open. The town swimmered like a pot about to boil over. One morning, Doon found a crowd gathered in the plaza when he came into a town for the work. Both Spark people and Ember people were clustered together, looking at something. He edged between them to see what it was. Across the pavement, someone has scrawled a message. It took as if he had been written in the mud. The sloppy, running letter said, "They must go." The crowd stared at it silently. A few often villagers seemed embarrassed. They looked sideways at the Embers and shook their heads. Mean, someone muttered. By other Sowell, one man noticing the Doon clad at him angrily so that the Doon felt as if he had been punched in the stomach. This message was there because of him. He knew it. He put his head down and hurried away. At the hotel at the night, people were upset. They clustered in the buzzing groups out of the front steps, talking about the words painting on the plaza. Doon saw a Dick striding among them, speaking with everyone. His face flushed and his eyes glittered. When he came towards the Doon, he paused. "They have turned against us," he said. "I knew they would. We mustn't stand for it." And he plunked back into the crowd. A day passed, and then another. The sun blazed down, but Doon felt as if the darkness had invaded him. Protects and the questions racked through in his mind. Why have the torrent pointed at him? Was it just a random, or had he signed him out of for a reason? Why didn't the chuggers believe Torrent and not believe him, who had been writing the muddy messages on the brick of the plaza? Lena did not return, and this added to the Doon's glumness. According to the note she had left Mrs. Mundo, she would have been back by now from whenever she had gone. Doon's feeling about her was divided between worry and anger. He tried not to think about her since there were nothing he could do. Whenever he had a free moment, he holed up with a book and tried to forget about what was happening in the village. Edward Pocket brought him a steady supply. Edward was absorbed with his job. Every now and then, Doon would ask him how it was going, and Edward would get a feverish look in his eyes and say, "Ha, it is going by inches, young Doon. By the millimeters, I have done this much." He held his thumb and forefingers at a tiny distance apart, and this much remains to be done. He stretched his arms as far as apart as they would go. It is a Granton task. I press forward, but I will finish it my lifetime. It is doubtful. His finger black with dust, he often comes home in the evening later than the workers who went into the villages, and he was so tired by then that he usually went straight to be the bed right after the dinner. Even though it was still light, Doon would hear him mumbling in his sleep inside their classes. He could make a sense of only a few words. Caterpillar. Edward would say cathedrals, cattle, chemistry, Christmas. Then he had groaned and thrashed about, hanging his bony limbs against the closest door, and go silent for a while. When he muttered again, he would be on a different letter. Hamlet, Harry Potter, Hawaii, heart surgery, hippopotamus, hog farming. Don't imagine that the Edward's mind was so stuffed with the information by now that there wasn't a room for any more, and the excess have started leaking out in the night. Sometimes Doon passed the Sparks school on his way to the work in the morning. It was a small building with a wide open porch all around it. where the students often sat to do their lessons. The children of the villages, there weren't very many of them, went to the schools only a few hours a day, and only until they were 10 years old. Kenny Patton went there. He would have waved to the Doon when he saw him going by, and before the trouble with the tomatoes, the other children would look at Don curiously, a few of them smiling. But the first time Doom passed the school after the tomato trouble, he was 15 or 20, cold eyes, face turning towards him. Someone shouted, "Get out of here!" and someone else threw a scribbled wad of a paper over the porch railing at him. He walked faster, looking straight ahead. A moment later, he heard the teacher scolding the class for the rudeness, but not very sternly. Thank you.